Hello, and welcome to everyone watching us. We've got many people from all over the world here to join for this event, UCL's event, Wow Wow, Who Owns What and Why? My name is Rana Faruhar. I'm an associate editor and global business columnist at the Financial Times. I'm also a global economic analyst for CNN, and I'm someone who's extremely interested in both the green and the deal part of the Green New Deal, which is what we're here to talk about today in the final talk of this series. Want to say a big thank you to the Omidyar Network for the funding that they've given to make the series possible. And of course, for the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL, which has put together the entire event. So thank you to you both. In today's talk, we're going to be focusing on the Green New Deal and really giving equal time to both the green and the deal part of it, understanding what do we need from business, from government, in terms of industrial policy, in terms of innovation, in terms of the value chain. Really, how do we need to restructure things on both the public and private side to get to where we need to be, not just in Europe or the US or Asia, but in a global sense. So a lot of ground to cover. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers. Mark Carney is currently the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance and Prime Minister Johnson's financial advisor for COP26. He is, of course, a member of the Arnold Distinguished Fellowship Program Board within the Conservation International Program, and he is an external member of Stripes Board, the global tech company that is building the infrastructure for the internet. Very interesting company. He's also, of course, previously governor of the Bank of England and governor of the Bank of Canada. So couldn't imagine a better person to talk about these issues with us. Thanks for being here, Mark.
Thank you for having me, Ron.
And Mariana Mazzucotto, who is a professor of economics and innovation and public value at the University College London, where she's also the founding director here at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And she is the author of 3 awesome books, which many of you, I hope, have read: The Entrepreneurial State, The Value of Everything, and The Mission Economy, which I feel like I was just here doing another Zoom with you on that book recently.
You were.
You advise policymakers everywhere around the world on these issues, and we're going to be talking about that too. So thanks for putting this together, and thanks for having me here with you for the discussion.
And thanks for coming twice. You're absolutely right. I think in 1 month we've had you. So super thanks.
Well, so I'm sorry. This stuff is near and dear to my heart. Okay, so we've got about 45 minutes for discussion amongst ourselves, and I'm gonna throw you all each a couple of questions to start with, but then we can just keep it very interactive since there's just the 3 of us. And then as we go along, I just want to remind the audience, keep sending your questions in about anything we're talking about, anything that we're missing that you want to hear, and those will be curated, and we'll make sure to get to as many as possible. So let me start, actually, Mariana, let me start with you, because you have really kind of reset the agenda in so many ways, not just on Green New Deal, but talking about value in the economy, about value and values. And I want to ask you, I guess, to define, when we talk about values and values theory in the economy, what do we mean and where are we moving from? You know, if we look at where we've been in terms of how the economy is structured in the last 40 years, the neoclassical model, or some might call it the neoliberal model in the US context, and where we're moving to in terms of values theory, tell us a little bit about that evolution. What does that mean for the layperson?
We've kind of gotten stuck thinking that value creation and wealth creation just happens inside of business. And we forget that actually value is collectively created, across all sorts of different agents. Everything that's in our iPhone was, to a large extent, everything that makes it smart, actually funded by a public institution, whether it's DARPA funding the internet, GPS funding the Navy, and so on. And of course, there's lots of different private companies. Again, back to the iPhone. Of course, Apple was very important and made this really simple, well-designed phone that everyone wants to buy. And the real question is, how do we also going forwards think about that, for example, for the green economy? What does it actually mean to have both public and private co-investing, co-creating value, co-shaping the economy, but a specific kind of economy that we want, right? More inclusive, more sustainable. That means that we should be talking about directionality of growth, not just the rate of growth. And that then, if you put that sort of at the heart of how we think about value, that means both having an idea of value as, again, collectively created, but also an explicit discussion and debate about what kind of value we actually want to be creating. And one of the problems in economic theory, which I talk about in the book, is that we've gotten stuck with this kind of subjective idea of value, where we end up we basically confuse not only prices with value, but the actual logic of the theory starts with the price mechanism itself. It starts with exchange. It starts with individual decisions that everyone's making and assuming that everyone's maximizing some sort of objective function. So workers are supposedly maximizing their decisions of leisure versus work. Companies are maximizing profits. Even government is somehow maximizing its ability to stay in power and so on, without actually stepping back and looking at how is value being produced in the economy? What is the objective way that production is actually happening? And how are the decisions not only being made, but also how is the value that's being created being distributed? And in fact, if you look at the early thinkers about value, like people like Adam Smith, Karl Marx, David Ricardo, they have what I call an objective view of value. They actually looked at production. So Adam Smith's whole book, The Wealth of Nations, was basically really looking at, say, the division of labor, how productivity increased, the effect of machinery on that and on growth and the wealth of nations. And that required actually, again, looking at production. So today, if we looked at how we are producing within digital platforms, how are algorithms structured? Who are all the different actors? What are they doing? Or in financial services, this very high level of intermediation activities that are actually taking on a lot of the GVA. That would require, again, stepping back and looking at production itself. And the problem that when you subjectify it, it makes it much harder sort of to do that. So what we end up with is all these individual maximizing decisions, formulating what economists look at, which is equilibrium prices. And then we end up saying these prices are revealing value. So what we end up actually putting into GDP, for example, or the prices of the activities, as opposed to actually asking what is the value of those activities? What are they producing? And I think, well, I'll shut up now because I could go on and on, but that's, in terms of the theory, I think it could benefit by actually stepping back and looking at the structures themselves, a structural view.
I want to pick up on much of what Mariana has just said, and just how foundational and important it is. And part of what I wrote, as Mariana knows, is trying to pick up elements of what she rightly emphasized, and in fact challenged us to collectively to have a debate on value and the origins of value and how to manage it and how to create it. The second point is that one of the things that also comes out through the history of value is that the theory of, economics used to be the theory of value, right, Mariana, until it became subjective, and then it became too easy, quote unquote, because it became all about the price, it became all about in the beholder, and much was lost in that. And I think one of the things that Mariana's emphasized, and I tried to pick up on, is that when you have big technological change, and Rana, you've written a lot about this and thought a lot about this, you have big technological change, we have these massive shifts in value allocation. However we measure it, we have these massive changes. So you tended historically to have different views of value theories. So the mercantilists, when we opened up to commerce, the physiocrats with agriculture, of course, Smith and the classicists, and Marx as industrialization, and you had these huge shifts in allocation between capital and labor. Then we lose it, we lose that focus and compound some of the challenges we've had over time, because we've been living through big technological changes, and some of it, the financialization of the economy, which led up to the financial crisis of 2008, and then point being, this may be too long of a buildup. Now we're in a position where we have two big rewirings of the economy, digital and sustainable. And those will result in huge shifts in value, however we define it. And the question is, and I think part of the challenge with, if I understand WOW and the motivation is, can we choose? And how do we frame the issues? And how do we get the market working for broader values? And where does the market, what do you allocate to the market? What do you allocate to the state? And what do you, I think, Rana, as you said at the start, quite rightly, it's a Green New Deal. And so who are the constituents of the deal, and what are we working towards? And I didn't mean to challenge too much the premise, but I don't think that in the when I was a central banker, we had a more narrowly defined set of objectives. And when you work, when you're in a democratic polity and your democracy gives you a specific task, you have to follow through on that task. But I wouldn't say that in the pursuit of those objectives that we looked on a narrow set of actors or excluded major actors in the fulfillment of that. I think what happened with the financial crisis, is one of the things that was learned, maybe should have been relearned is probably a better way to put it, was around the interrelationship between financial stability and broader social impacts. And of course, and I'll finish on this, one of the things that, apart from Mariana's work and other experiences, which got me to really focus on these sets of issues, was the consequence of that financial crisis, and I'll finish on this point, particularly in the UK, was it's now more than a decade, given the COVID experience, of lost decade. Real incomes didn't grow. Average real incomes did not grow in the UK. And the last time that happened is we had a revolution in value theory, which because Karl Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto at a time of great industrial change, financial problems, big shifts in value, and that comes. So all of this is context for a bigger discussion.
Let me ask you a more specific question. I'm going to give you a real world example here.
Okay.
Because we've got a lot of lay people as well as academics listening to this, and we all kind of know the pain of the last decade. How do we get beyond it? In my first book, for example, I looked at how the neoclassical model basically screwed up the handling the financial crisis. In America, for example, 96% of the consultation meetings about how to reform the banking system were taken with the top 3 banks. That's a pretty narrow group of stakeholders. That's a classic neo model mistake. How do we make sure that doesn't happen with trying to fix climate change? What do we need to do?
Well, that's quite remarkable in the U.S. That says something about the U.S. Political economy, because that was not the case in other jurisdictions. I'm just absorbing that figure, which is quite remarkable. How do we not do that with climate change? Well, I think the first thing is recognizing and constantly emphasizing just how comprehensive the issue and the solutions to the issue are, which then drives anyone who's involved in it to recognize that they are part of a much bigger solution, not the solution, and always be suspicious of anyone who says, it's just, if we need a carbon tax, we need climate disclosure in the financial sector, we need these one things, we need hydrogen. It's just far too big a problem. So the first thing is recognizing the enormity of the problem and the discipline of that, and there needs multiple solutions. First point. Second point, and maybe I'll only make 2 points to dominate, but is that I think there is an approach here. We need engineering solutions. We need technology, obviously, and there's questions of how you develop those and how you deploy those at scale. We need a role for. We need a consensus about where we want to go. We need a consensus around the value, or I would say the value of sustainability and resilience, and what society wants. And we need that as in a hierarchy, that is the objective. It's not there as part of a trade-off. And then we need to organize markets as part of the support for that. And a critical point that I've been trying to get across and is that, and I think you agree with this, Mariana, but what an economist ends up always, and I end up in a trade-off world, trading off short and long term, trading off planet and profit in that regard. And there's always an optimization. And of course, I'm sorry to bring it back into the value conversation, but that's where the subjective approach, something where everything has a price, is so seductive, because once everything has a price, you do that trade-off, you do that optimization, you have the tools in order to do that. And if something doesn't have a price, then you ascribe a price to it, you impute a price to it, and then you do the same thing. And what is different and what is necessary for the climate crisis, which is what brings everyone in, is to say, no, we have a clear goal that is above others, which is to get to sustainability. It's represented by getting to net zero as the route to sustainability. That doesn't solve, as you well know, biodiversity and other things, but for actually stabilizing the planet. And so how do we then organize ourselves in order to achieve that goal? And so that's one way into a very sharp question that you asked in terms of, but well, I'll leave it there.
Mariana, let me ask you to just, I have a question for you, but do you want to comment on anything Mark's just said?
Yep. So just to highlight a word he used, which is we need to organize markets in a particular way. And I think that's a really important point. That's actually why I set up IIPP, this Institute on Public Purpose, because we often confuse the word business with markets. Markets are actually outcomes. They're outcomes of how we organize all the different value creating institutions. And I think we have a crisis in all of them. We have a crisis right now in how we're governing the state and state structures, this idea that at best policy can fix market failures. You literally will always be, by definition, too little, too late. You actually have to wait for things to fail, to kind of screw up before you come in, or to worry that they might fail. So, a different approach to actually how you set up the remit of a public entity, whether it's a research institution, whether it's even a digital agency, whether it's a Department of Health, is around market shaping and market co-creation. And the reason I set up IIPP is I think that the tools, how you then design procurement, how you design grants and loans around a market shaping lens is very different from one about market fixing. And I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. Market fixing and market failure theory is useful, but the problem is it's just bandaging up the system. So that's one big failure. Another one is in the private sector. Mark mentioned the word financialization, and I've written quite a bit about that, and you can just see the numbers. $4 trillion have been spent by S&P 500 companies in the last 10 years just to buy back their shares, to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. And there's starting to be a move away from that. This idea that shareholder value is not the only metric. We need stakeholder value. What does it actually, though, mean to put stakeholder value and purpose and what I call missions at the center of how public and private actually interact, so at the center of the system? And so markets are the outcomes of how we organize the private sector, the public sector, but also how we organize and design their interrelationships. And in terms of the Green Deal, that's why, again, something that you said, Ron, in the beginning about the deal being so important, I actually think that's the really kind of, that's where we need more thought leadership. So the green bit, as Greta Thunberg says, listen to the science. The deal bit actually means redesigning the social contract, redesigning public-private relationships, redesigning also the degree to which we allow movements, social movements, which we shouldn't forget got us the weekend, the 8-hour workday. Kids aren't,
8-hour workday. Where's that 8-hour workday, Mariana?
Yeah, but anyway, so the Green Deal, I think, needs to unpick all that. What does it mean for government structures, for private structures, the interrelationship, and the deal at the center of that? Just one super last thing. Sorry. The fact that there's all this money now being poured into the system, this kind of came back to your initial question to Mark. What we had with the financial crisis was huge amounts of liquidity poured into the system. Most of that ended up back in the financial sector. This time, this whole idea of building back better, where the better bit has a huge kind of green and sustainable, a transition bit of it, that means we have to do it differently. But how then to make sure this money that's being injected lands on concrete structures, but also that the public bit of it, so the bailouts, the recovery funds, have deals at the center to make sure that companies that are receiving the recovery funds are actually transforming towards a sustainable transition. That's a design challenge, and that can be done. I can give you examples later, but that's not just about pouring money and talking about green.
We're going to, by the way, we have a lot of time. We're going to come to a lot of the particulars and the structures that you guys are sort of hinting at. But Mariana, let me ask you one other, I guess, really big picture question in this conversation about value and values. One of the difficult things I find as we kind of transition from neoclassical models to other models, there was a certain elegance, let's say, or simplicity, perhaps is the word, to the U Chicago kind of laissez-faire shareholder value model. It's share price. That's easy. We're all coming to the understanding that share price doesn't get you where you need to be in terms of values, and really thinking about the true meaning of growth and what kind of growth you want. But once you start moving away from a single metric, things get more complicated, and they also get more political. So what do you say? And I'd actually be curious what both of you say to this, that there are a lot of models now, a lot of metrics being thrown around. And Mark, I'm going to come back and ask you what you think about some of Larry Fink's recent comments. But Mariana, first to you, when people say to you, well, all right, if share price isn't the metric, what is the metric? Who gets to decide the metric? How can we make this something that doesn't get completely out of control or politically co-opted? What do you say?
Well, I think an important point to say first is it's not just that it's wrong because it's a bad metric. It's actually founded on, I think, wrong assumptions. So if you look at the theory of shareholder value, the underlying assumption is that only shareholders are the biggest risk takers. You know, Michael Jensen's work there, the residual claimant. So everyone else in society apparently has a guaranteed rate of return, you know, government, banks, workers. So actually coming back to that point about value being not only collectively created, but risk is being collectively taken, right? Instead of just thinking that, for example, that the public sector is de-risking the private sector, this word that I try never to use, it's actually been taking risks. For every internet, there's many failures. For every Tesla investment that the government made, because it did come from early government investment, there's many cylinders. So that idea of also unpicking the underlying assumptions about risk-taking and the residual claimant actually shows just how faulty the theory of shareholder value maximization is. And then the other thing is, you know, would you ever drive a car with one piece of information, how much gas is in it, not knowing how fast you're going, or vice versa? Of course not. So it's not about like flooding the dashboard with, you know, a lot of random metrics, but also being very careful what those metrics should be. And by the way, environmental economists and feminist economists have been telling us for a long time, for example, that GDP is way too limiting, but it doesn't mean you throw out GDP, for example. You know, one of the stats that Mark was hinting at, which is that in the UK, for example, the ratio of private debt to disposable income is back at a record level, partially because people have to take on debt just to, have sort of, a living standards because their wages haven't grown for 30 years. You can actually see that with the traditional, a metric of GDP. You can see that we're only growing through consumption and not investment. Remember, GDP is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. If we wanted to see certain really interesting things with this kind of, problematic notion of growth for all the reasons we all know, fine, but we're not actually using it even to, highlight these very problematic trends around financialization and debt-driven consumption-led growth. So, in that literature, for example, of course, we need well-being and wellness, and of course, we should be bringing in other measures. But the first question is, what are we even trying to look at? And then backtracking and saying, what are the different, things that should be on that dashboard? But it's not about, 1 or 20. It's how do you even understand how the economy functions? And that's why we need to go to the underlying assumptions, but also ask ourselves, what are you even trying to do? If you're just trying to fix markets, you would have a particular dashboard. If you're trying to co-create and co-shape them towards inclusive and sustainable growth, you'll have very different metrics.
Yeah, it's a big screen you're talking about. Mark, if you want to build on that with any comments, and we've got a couple of questions, actually more than a couple of questions, just coming through about this very topic. Is ESG the right framework? Is it ambitious enough? I was kind of struck, just as I was saying earlier, by some of Larry Fink's comments about how the IMF and the World Bank should be acting more like Fannie and Freddie Mac. How do you think about all this? Give us a few points to work with.
Okay, that's a pretty broad canvas there, Rana, between what Larry was talking about in first law structures. And let me build a bit on what Mariana was saying, and maybe we can come back to the specific. So one of the other challenges with the shareholder primacy approach, the Friedman approach, is that it makes a very large assumption, which is that it's the best system subject to the prevailing customs and norms and beliefs being maintained. So puts that caveat in at the end of his essay. Well, of course, from Smith and well before Smith, Hayek even, there's a total recognition that these norms and beliefs in society are not fixed, that there are certain customs and beliefs that are necessary to buttress and ensure that markets function well, a belief in fairness, a broad sense of trust. We see this, there's multiple examples of that. And what happened, and we began to see it in particular in the financial sector, and I was one of those who had to help clean up the mess, is that that underlying loss of values in the financialization of large parts of markets undercut the functioning of the market itself. And those are problems that you can't just fix with regulation. You can improve with regulation, but you can't fundamentally fix those cultures. So there's one element of this. I'm going to make 3 points which are related to this. They're not all building to some grand conclusion. But the second is there is an element of a stakeholder approach, or I would say particularly the word Mariana used earlier, purpose-driven companies. There is an element where you get greater divine coincidence in that actually over time you're creating more shareholder value as a consequence of this. And the reason, not surprisingly, is you get greater alignment. Done properly in the goal, you get greater alignment to your employees, your suppliers you work with the communities in which you operate in, even sometimes your clients. And that is, you referenced a company I'm involved with, which, growing the GDP of the internet. I mean, that focuses on how do we help companies that do more online, and how does it all fit together? That you do it right, you actually are helping your shareholders over time, but it changes the perspective and you move beyond. And again, I'm relying on those academics in the crowd. You're moving beyond a sort of contractual based theory of the firm type approach, because the firm becomes more permeable of what it's doing. Okay. Hard to do, but a different approach. The other point I wanted to make just quickly, and it kind of segues a bit into the ESG world, which is there are some issues. The concept, and this is a concept that is at the heart of sort of European disclosure around, I'll call it ESG, but this is formally regulated or soon to be regulated disclosure around double materiality. So not just issues that are environmental and social, have to do with my governance that can affect my enterprise value as a company, but how do I affect, where do I have a material impact, even if today it doesn't impact the price of my products or the cost of doing business. And the reason for double materiality is social license. I mean, I'm going to simplify it to social license. And we have seen rightly in recent years where there's situations where companies are doing things which have an impact in terms of their ability to, at a minimum, attract good people, but often to operate. And you don't have that information. You can't form those judgments. Now, I'd suggest on what Larry, I was actually on the panel, whatever, with Larry 2 days ago when he said it. I don't view that as an ESG issue per se. What he was talking about was he was talking about financial architecture to get greater investment in net zero activities in emerging developing countries. And one of the ways he was suggesting, which actually just to sort of stir the controversy here, is that was the public sector take a bunch of risk off from the private sector, which is the first loss. And so actually these entities that lend, which are normally seen as preferred creditors, so last loss, would become the last shall be first in this case. A slight different use of the thing. But I'll finish on this and we can explore it more if you like. This is hugely important to the overall Green Deal and the ultimate, that the fact is we need to scale up, the collective world needs to scale up by 1 to 2 trillion per annum extra of energy investment in emerging and developing economies if we're going to get to net zero. So it's a massive increase that needs to happen. And the question is, how do we organize in order for that to happen? How much is public money? How much is private? How much is private that's helped by public? And it's of an order of magnitude that, and I very much welcome what he said. I said something different, but on the same point, which is that we need to be talking in terms of hundreds of billions. What are we doing that's adding hundreds of billions per year of flows to emerging developing economies on decarbonization or a more sustainable economies there, or otherwise it's just not interesting. I mean, it just isn't big enough to move the needle. So we need to get the numbers right, the orders of magnitude right.
Let me. I'm actually going to go into a topic I was going to do later, but it's coming up in questions as we talk about the size, the magnitude of investment that is needed, of stimulus that is needed. The question of inflation naturally comes up, and I'd love to get both of your thoughts on that. I mean, we have a question from the audience. Is rising inflation, assuming it's more than a transitory phenomenon, a threat to the goals of the Green New Deal? If so, what can we do about it? Mariana, why don't you start, and then Mark, I want to come back to you.
I mean, the whole thing with inflation, even just like in general, is that I don't know how many people know this, but you can just see it if you download the data from, GDP data, for example, and consumer price index data. There was no inflation basically up until World War II. There was often deflation. The rise of inflation, even moderate inflation, 2, 3, 4%, which is more or less fine. I mean, it depends what one thinks is the natural rate of inflation, is an outcome of government having come in post Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who convinced governments that actually you needed counter-cyclical investment, not pro-cyclical investments, because before he said that what you had was pro-cyclical government. So in bad times, they cut back, in good times, they overinvested. So you constantly had this boom and bust cycle. And you had, before World War II, constant depressions. Nowadays, we have recessions coming now and then. Back then, you can just see it in the data. Depressions more or less every 10 to 15 years. So once you get government doing what it should be doing, which is the Keynesian role to make sure that the government is not acting like a private citizen, because private citizens will obviously cut back during bad times and be more spending in good times, that's when you stop getting depressions. Basically, we tame the recession, it doesn't turn into a depression. So really the question then is how much, right? How much counter-cyclical investment? And as long as it's strategic and what I call mission oriented and expanding the productive capacity of the economy, fostering innovation, investment, not just flooding the system with helicopter money, in theory, there's no reason that you will have high inflation, because you would have inflation if the economy remains stagnant and static. You're not expanding its productive capacity. You're not innovating. You're not increasing investment. And you're just increasing the amount of, say, government spending, right? So increasing also in some ways liquidity in the system. Then you might have a static pie. Think of the economy as a pie, more money being put into the system. So every bit of that pie will have more money on it. So you'll have inflation. So that's when you don't actually have also kind of smart fiscal policy, investment policy, industrial strategy, and innovation policy. That's why the whole Build Back Better agenda of the Biden administration, it's very important that it be complemented, not just in terms of, infrastructure for the sake of infrastructure, but green infrastructure, which will require transformation of the existing infrastructure. It will require a transformation of businesses, of the steel sector, to become more sustainable. But that doesn't happen on its own. So for example, in Germany, one example I often bring up because I just think it's a really interesting one, when the steel sector, which is having problems all over the place, asked the German government in Germany for a loan, because they actually had a strategy at the high level, the Energiewende strategy, the loan that was provided by the public bank called the KfW was conditional on steel lowering its material content, which it had to do to get €1 out of the government. And they did it through repurpose, reuse, recycle technology throughout their whole value chain. That required investment, innovation, new capacity, new skills, new training of workers. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of expanding, right, the economy. So as long as you're doing that, as long as you have this kind of conditionality at the center of public and private, as long as what the public sector is doing in terms of infrastructure is transforming the infrastructure, making it smarter, greener, more sustainable, but also more inclusive in terms of also ambitions around that, then in theory, you don't necessarily have inflation. If instead you're just flooding the system with liquidity, of course, that's a problem.
Okay. Mark, want to hear what you have to say about inflation. Let me also just bring in, because it's relevant to this discussion, a question from the audience. After the 2008 meltdown, Draghi said that the European Central Bank would do whatever it took should central bankers announce that they will do whatever it takes to tackle the climate crisis. Could they, for example, prohibit red-listed investments in new fossil fuel developments or underwrite loans for green infrastructure investment?
Well, there's two pretty big questions there. The first is in around inflation. So, and I think the audience question started with this sort of current situation, transitory, and then went to, transitory or not. And I guess the first point just to make, which, and I suspect that the person who asked the question recognizes this, most of what we're seeing is not, it's not Green New Deal related inflation of this. We're here talking about the conditions that need to be put in place and then actually executing on that. And so, and somebody really wants to hear my view on inflation. Nobody does anymore now that I don't have any responsibility for it. So we can go back into the shorter term, but let's go to the sort of inflationary or not dynamics of tackling sustainability in a meaningful way, which is there are elements of this which are inflationary because there are a few things that will have to happen. Some of them relate to certain commodities that are essential for activities. So copper is quite relevant. I mean, we need to electrify. We need to go, green grids and electrify as much as possible. And, you need some copper for that. You certainly need rare earths and other certain, commodities that are relevant. So this is relevant to them, and it has some flow through. I wouldn't overplay that, but that's recognized. We will have some, this is a big structural change. So there's some reallocation frictions that can develop in the economy, and that could be, it could be inflationary, could be, it doesn't necessarily, and Mariana was just going through how you can mitigate a lot of that. One thing we will also have, though, is, well, again, I think in order to accomplish what we need is that there will be, for a period of time, a rising price of carbon, either explicitly, for a long period of time, either explicitly or implicitly through regulation, that has the effect of a steady increase in the price of carbon. And that's a bit akin to having a rising value-added tax over time, which flows through to a lot of prices. And so the question is, how do you lean against that in terms of achieving inflation? It can be done, but it has to be watched. I think the central banks are able to, anticipate, and particularly with credible and predictable climate policy, it's easier to address that. And so that, again, now there's lots of reasons why you want credible and predictable climate policy for a Green New Deal. So think of things like banning, as in the UK, I think we're all, well, no, we're not, 2/3 of this panel is in the UK at the moment. In the UK, you can't sell a new internal combustion engine vehicle after 2030. That is credible, predictable climate policy. That has an impact, obviously, on investment today, as we're seeing in the UK. People are thinking, okay, what the supply chain for the new auto sector, but it also has an impact on inflation. The last point I want to make, though, around inflation and the dynamics here is that one of the things that we have been living through, as I think we all know, since the financial crisis, has been that the equilibrium level of interest rates has been very low, if not negative. We've been in a pretty close, if not in a liquidity trap for a long period of time. And one of the advantages, I mean, this is a macroeconomic advantage of a Green New Deal, is that it is very investment intensive. And that shifts investment relative to savings. That moves up the equilibrium level of interest rates. That means, actually, over time, it will mean less QE because it becomes more about the conventional instruments of monetary policy. Now, I can't give you an exact prediction of when that happens. It partly depends on how successful both public and private investment, the encouragement of public and private investment is. I think my pithy answer to the Mario Draghi question is the challenge is to governments first and foremost. Are you doing whatever it takes in terms of regulation, activity, et cetera, to address this? I mean, central banks have a role, but I think if the strategy is, hey, let's rely on the central banks to solve this, I mean, that is we're in real trouble.
Yeah, we've been doing that for a number of decades now.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on. Just we have so many super interesting questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to wait on a few of those, but I want to make sure that we kind of moor the discussion in a little bit in the reality of what's happening in terms of different policy responses, and also what business is doing in Europe, in the UK, in the US, and kind of maybe if you guys can give us a little bit of a scorecard and possibly try and connect the dots where there might be low-hanging fruit, commonality between different areas in the policy response, what folks can learn from one another. I spoke, just as a kind of an interesting aside, I spoke recently to a French diplomat who said he was very worried at this moment that even though there's kind of a vectoral agreement on both sides of the Atlantic about where we need to go and what needs to happen, that we were going to get kind of lost in a ways and means discussion. And I'm curious, Mariana, do you agree with that? And where are the points of commonality that we can all kind of cohere around right now?
So, I mean, I think it's also important to be positive when there's things to be positive about. And the European recovery, if I can just say something about that right now, the what's called the Next Gen EU COVID recovery scheme is quite interesting, because unlike the recovery after the financial crisis, which you'll remember was conditional on the member states in Europe basically cutting their deficits. That was the main condition, especially for the pig countries. And that was a terrible word that Goldman Sachs came out with: Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Pigs.
Yeah.
So I'm Italian, I'm allowed to say it. In German cannot call Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain pigs. The condition was that especially these southern countries cut their deficits. Now, the condition is that they invest, that they actually have an investment strategy around two key areas: climate mitigation and digitalization, to reduce the digital divide, which, by the way, under COVID-19, you'll know, has been, very much highlighted as a huge problem with all these kids in lockdown not having their equal, access to their human right to education. So that's a really important change. Forget whether it's perfect, forget whether it could be made better. Of course it can. But the fact that we have conditionalities, and these are public conditionalities. I talked before about public-private conditionalities. That's a huge step forward. And what's then happening at the member state level is that there's this scramble to come up with projects around climate and digitalization. I think there we need to pause, because we don't want just a shopping list of different kind of small things that maybe would have happened anyway, and we just put them on the list for the recovery program. That's why I actually, wrote this book called Mission Economy. I said, we didn't get to the moon by just saying, oh, come up with a lot of little solutions for how to get there. There is a very clear kind of direction from government, from NASA, from Kennedy, getting to the moon and back in one generation. There was lots of different private investment. There was sectors as different as nutrition, electronics, materials, software. The entire software industry could be almost seen as a spillover of the moon landing. But also what government did, which it has to learn how to do, this is the kind of lack of public sector capacity due to the massive outsourcing to consulting companies of what government should be doing. What we need is that the tools, I keep coming back to that, the loans, the grants, the procurement. Procurement is a huge chunk of every government's budget, be designed in such a way to crowd in as much private sector investment as possible to fulfill the goal. Right. So it's not micromanaged by the government, but it is directed. The goal is clear. So, all sorts of different goals around carbon neutrality, or in Sweden, for example, it's so interesting. They're putting these fossil free / sustainability / carbon neutral targets at every kind of granular level of government, like school meals. Every school meal has to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. Yeah. Right. But that has to be designed into the contract. So again, coming back to the public-private, not only does it foster a more symbiotic, less of a parasitic partnership, which we have in many sectors like health, huge amounts of money going in from the public sector, and the prices don't kind of match up to show that of the drugs, but also that crowding in effect. And, coming back to the central banks, no one institution, this is something I think Mark said in the beginning, no one institution can solve any of these problems we have underneath the SDGs. You need the government to lead and to crowd in as many different sources of finance to solve problems. And today we're talking about the climate problem, but there's many other problems. How you do that has to be designed into the institution itself. So we've just written a report for the EIB, for example, that if the European Investment Bank wants to be a climate bank, it's going to have to start changing its own governance structure.
Let me stop you for 1 minute, because you hit on something, the issue of food is really interesting, and I want to drill down and get both of you guys to weigh on this. This idea that you could use, which is happening in Europe, school lunches as a pivot point to shift agriculture, which is a major part of the climate puzzle. Let's say in America right now, there are about 30 million school lunches served, right, and a lot of them. There's a big tie-in to the food stamp program, which has a big tie-in to large agricultural firms and the subsidy of cash crops, which is terrible for the environment. There right there is a huge turn that could be made. What could, Mark, I'm going to ask you first, and then Mariana, I'll ask you to come back. if you were looking at that one discrete problem, I'm trying to kind of like remoor this conversation in something real that people can feel, their food on their plate that their kids eat every day. What could the public sector do? What would you want to see? And what could the private sector do?
I think you know the answer to your own question because you started it with your premise, right? Which is that
I don't actually. I have an idea, but I'd
I
like to hear
mean,
yours.
look, I mean, I'll be blunt. I haven't thought a lot about the food industry. I mean, I think I'd go back to if I may, because the first question was, what do we learn from each other? What works? And I think this is really important, which is, well, what works? A Canadian style carbon price legislated and rebated to individuals every quarter. That works, right? That works. That is a very clear market signal. Its carbon price is $170 in 2030. It's in legislation, but individuals up to the 70th percentile are coming out net ahead. Now they all don't do their carbon price calculation, but they're, the net there with the relative price. I think the sort of regulatory measures that are clear, and the food one would be an example of that, which is a demand pull lever measure, but also the regulatory measures that are in the future have a bigger impact, a bigger impact than commonly recognized, because there's time for companies and businesses to invest. So the internal combustion engine example is one. Hydrogen fuel blends, very valuable. Hydrogen fuel blends, even in as small as a couple percentage points into natural gas that's delivered to the home, actually can help tip the economics of electrolyzers, which are necessary for the broader hydrogen economy. R&D, what works and what isn't done. And now I'm going to quote from memory the same thing that Larry Fink was speaking at. Bill Nordhaus, a professor, opened it, and one of his slides, and I don't have the source for it, but the orders of magnitude is the point. Was that primary R&D spend by the U.S. government and this was from 2 years ago or so, in, let's say, primary research for sustainable technologies was around 2 or 3 billion, and for advanced weapon systems was 60 or 65 billion. Like, I mean, just and what we have now, more positively, and I think it's important to emphasize positive, in Europe, in the UK, in Canada, I think you're closer to it in the US as well, which is a increased focus on some common technological challenges: hydrogen, carbon capture storage, lesser extent sustainable aviation fuel, but and to the extent to which that can be collaborative, knowledge shared, crowdsourced. I mean, we did it for viruses. We did elements of that for vaccines, I should say, quite rightly. So I'm sorry not to give a good answer to the food one, but these are the type of, that's what I see working. And in all those cases, I'll finish on this, is what Mariana was saying, which is that as if you're a private investor, you're an innovator and others, you're sitting there saying, well, wait a minute. Oh, we need a solution for hydrogen. We need a direct air capture. It needs to move forward. There's some money there. There's some demand that's going to be there in the future. I will put, I'll dedicate some of my time, or I'll put some of my capital in that area. And that's what's crowding in the private investment. And it won't, a lot of it won't succeed, but that's fine. We don't need all of them succeed. We need some breakthrough technologies. That's why they're called breakthrough technologies. So, and last point is, again, something Mariana said: we can have a Solyndra if we have a Tesla, right? Or components that contribute to that, and that's the attitude we're going to have.
Let me just throw in, there's an interesting point / question from the audience, and Mariana, maybe you can respond to this. In order to get to credible and predictable climate policies, do we need to create new institutions with responsibility, discrete responsibility for those policies? For example, in his book, Mark suggests creating central bank-like carbon councils. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I mean, it won't be surprising to you that I would agree in a general way, because that is, again, the whole premise of you can't just fix markets, you can't just de-risk. You also need particular types of institutions that see their remit as co-shaping and co-creating the economy. So for example, if you look at state investment banks and development banks, which by the way, on their own aren't enough if they're just handout machines giving out money to whichever sector or firm kind of yells the loudest. But if you have kind of strategic, mission-oriented development banks that are really focused on climate solutions, then the way that they actually then lend out money to the business sector will be in such a way to provide that patient, long-term, strategic, committed finance, not just short-term finance, of which we have plenty of, which, if done well, again, can crowd in all sorts of other finance. That's the whole point also of in Europe, trying to get the ECB, the European Central Bank, and the EIB to work a bit more hand in hand. The ECB can continue to retain kind of independence, but be a bit more aligned in terms of also helping with the EIB actually funneling money in the directions if we really do want a smart, inclusive, sustainable Europe. But coming back to this portfolio point that Mark mentioned, one of the reasons I wrote Mission Economy is that what I've been trying to do with governments is kind of to say exactly the point that Mark said, which is, why do we only treat as urgent wartime kind of scenarios, the military industrial complex, or a pandemic when it's too late? This trillions going into the system now, it's a bit too late, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we should have been financing and reimagining and resourcing and nurturing, for example, our health systems much more in a continuous way, not just saying, oh, now put money into the NHS. And I'm just talking about the UK institution on the back of 10 years of kind of defunding it. And, that's global. Had this crisis, this pandemic begun in Africa and not in China, we would all globally be worse off, because unfortunately, health systems in many African countries remain really, really weak. So I think there's a real opportunity to wake up and to, both with the climate battle, and that unfortunately we're not battling quickly enough, and the COVID pandemic, to realize that we need to kind of reimagine also the welfare state itself. It's not just about saying we need health systems. What kind of health systems? How can we make sure that they are strong, that they're resilient, that they are innovative? Yeah. And in some ways using the welfare state itself as a funnel for innovation. That's why I talk a lot about procurement. But that portfolio approach, that kind of Tesla Solyndra example, which I always give because people don't know, like, we only know about the failures of government, the Solyndra. So few people know that the same amount of money went to Tesla. But the second step should have been for Obama, because it happened in 2009, that Tesla got a 465 million guaranteed loan. Solyndra got 500 million. Solyndra went bust. Everyone said, government is stupid. It just, should just level the playing field and get out of the way. What government should have done is not what it did, which is to say to Elon Musk, if you don't pay back the loan, we get 3 million shares in your company, which makes no sense. Had they said the opposite, given that Tesla did succeed, did pay back the loan, the price per share in that time, 2009, 2013, I often say this just because I think it's such a good example, if we could kind of systematize it, went from 9 to 90. So had they retained 3 million shares based on the success, not the failure, that difference, 90 minus 9 multiplied by 3 million, would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss in the next round of investment. So kind of thinking also about government, not just as a lender of last resort, not just as a market fixer, but as an investor first resort, and a strategic investor, not micromanaging and not deciding at the project level, but choosing a direction and having a portfolio with more than one egg in the basket, and admitting that, some will lose, some will be successful, but we're not just going to ask the taxpayer to bail out the failures, but also to kind of get a share of the successes. And that can be done in all sorts of ways. In this case, it would have been through temporary kind of equity stakes, but you can also do it in the health sector by making sure that prices are actually taking into account the public contribution. You can do it now with the vaccine to make sure we're not allowing patents to be abused. I mean, in general, we should make sure that patents are not too upstream, not too wide, not too strong. That means that we should be governing, coming back to the early point, governing production and innovation towards kind of public good, common good criteria. And that means you can't just put money into innovation and hope for the best. You need to govern that process. And, one of the problems, I think, with just de-risking the private sector in ways that also, many countries do when they think that's the role of government, is that you do end up actually socializing risks, but privatizing rewards.
Well, you're touching on something that a lot of people have been bringing up in questions. I have to say, I wish that I think it's great for you to talk about Tesla as much as possible, because that message still has not gotten out, at least in the US. I mean, I don't even think most people know that Tesla received.
Well, Elon Musk got 5 billion so far. Actually, as of 5 years ago, last time I saw it, he got 5 billion from Uncle Sam for his 3 companies, Solar City, Tesla, and
yeah. All right, let's
SpaceX.
one more kind of meta topic before we move on to some of the audience questions. And you kind of touched on it, Mariana. The commonality between Green New Deal, the post-COVID recovery, making sure that our policy decisions are leading us proactively to more resilience for whatever future crisis may come, versus being reactive. And Mark, I'd love, maybe you could start on that. What do you see as the commonality? Where do you see as the low-hanging fruit? Someone has asked about potentially a universal job guarantee, your thoughts.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and there is a lot to that. There's a lot that's right about that, and I'll just reference just to make it more tangible around pandemic and pandemic preparedness. There was a report released for the G20. Tharman Shugaratnam chaired it. I think Larry Summers was involved. There was a panel struck by the G20. The report just came out over the weekend. I don't have the exact name in front of me, although I read it. What I retained was just how small, and they calls for a substantial ramping up of pandemic preparedness spend. So sums on health vaccine, more funding for the WHO, a body that shares in real time both with health ministers, finance ministers, health officials, threats, emerging vulnerabilities, but also spend for pandemic preparedness, the type of PPE type things we've all realized we need, but also health capacity. Anyways, the return, it is, according to the report and the calculations they do, it is a significant amount of money measured in the tens of billions that's required globally. And the return on this is something like 300 times, right? Because at some point you have the pandemic, or to be more specific, you have the possibility of an emergence of a pandemic, which doesn't happen. And this is interesting. I mean, this is one of the issues, just to draw an imperfect analogy to the financial sector, is our banks now carry, at least as a requirement, they carry ultimately about 4.5 times more capital than they did before, but the requirement went up 10 times. Lots of other things happened. Now, the probability that there will be a crisis, and there will be problems in the financial sector, I'm not waving my hand saying it won't be, but the probability and the frequency of a crisis has gone down quite significantly as a consequence of that and other things. But I can't prove that. I mean, I can point to the fact that actually when we had a pandemic and a big massive hit, that the whole financial sector didn't roll over, and it was more part of the solution than part of the problem. Still lots of issues in the financial sector. I'm not whitewashing it, but you can't prove a counterfactual. This is the one area where success is an orphan. Normally failure is an orphan. No one wants to be anywhere around, but success is an orphan because the thing doesn't happen. Okay, go to climate. So one of the ways to look at it is, and we can do this, but it's on the basis of counterfactuals. And I'll get to substance in a second, but just to frame it, which is that there are now macroeconomic scenarios of what happens if we have business as usual. And obviously there's lots of bad climate outcomes, but what does that do to the economy? And by the way, none of this is valuing what it does to human lives lost and others, which is a whole other separate and fundamental topic. But what does it do to the economy versus the costs and the returns to the economy of us getting on this path that we've been talking about, this, I'll call it the Green New Deal path, but a 1.5 degree path. And the return for the upfront investments relative to the cost, it's not 300 times, but it's double digit right then and there. And that's not valuing all these other things like species, people's lives, migration, geopolitical tensions, and other things that would some of which will assuredly be associated with unmitigated climate change, others which would be likely. Now, so how do you do that? How do you bring it into action? Part of this is what we have been discussing in terms of clarity on objective, clarity on policy in order to achieve, or greater clarity on policy in order to achieve the objective. You kindly mentioned, or maybe it was a question about carbon councils or what we have, the Climate Change Committee here in the UK, an objective expert body which does an assessment of, well, the government says we're trying to get to 68% down on 1990 levels by 2030. How well do the policies that are in place stack up relative to that objective? How big is the gap? What more is required? That's part of the way we show how resilient we really are today, and what more might, and then you end up in a competition of ideas in the political system, not about the objective, but about how to get there, and more broadly. Now, I may have strayed off the question a bit, but I think, you know, this type of approach, this is really what draws together elements of the financial crisis, because we're trying to prevent this thing, but very much COVID preparedness and climate preparedness. Last point, it was horrible, the financial crisis. It had all these knock-on effects that, you know, we're still lingering effects, but, you know, you can pick yourself up again and move forward. We don't get a do-over on the climate crisis. I mean, that's the issue. And so we have to really apply these lessons today from what we've just seen.
Okay,
can I just add one thing?
Please.
Is that okay? Yeah, I mean, just because I think the point that Mark made is so important in terms of the parallel. So, you know, Nick Stern's early work was all that the cost of not acting is actually going to be, you know, greater than the cost of acting now. And the pandemic is absolutely that. And on the one hand, we should say that and say it again and get the right modeling and so on, the kind of long-term versus short-term costs. But we should also sometimes reverse the logic. So I've just set up, or Dr. Tedros asked me to set up a World Health Organization Council on the economics of health for all, right? So the all bit is really important. But, and by the way, it's only women. Sorry, Mark. And if you ask me why not? Anyway.
It's only qualified people,
yeah.
is what you're saying. Yes,
Exactly.
I'm not on
From every continent, but only women. Yeah. And the idea was this: there was no lack of studies, you know, very important studies showing that investing in health is good for the economy, and we should have more of those studies. They can be perfected and so on. But there's also value in doing the opposite, to say, look, how about if we start with, let's invest in health for all, because it's the right thing to do, right? Because there's all sorts of, coming also to Mark's book on, you know, it's the right thing to do based on morality, on ethics, in order not to have things like vaccine apartheid and the great moral failure that we have, that Dr. Tedros talks about. And then you work backwards on the economy and say, what does that mean for budgeting? What does outcomes-based budgeting look like? What does, again, outcomes-based procurement look like? Which again, NASA did. NASA changed its procurement strategy when it cared to get to the moon. It changed it from cost plus, which just meant cost could go to whatever, to fixed price, like a prize, but with incentives for innovation and quality improvement. They also, by the way, had no excess profits. This is great, in their clauses in the procurement contract. So if we're going to do this together, don't make it into a gambling casino, please. Look at what's happening at space today when you don't have those contracts. So, you know, work backwards on procurement, on the grants and the loans, the budgeting, the deficits, how to think also about the global economy, the city economy. Mark, in your inbox, you have an invitation for November 3rd for another council we've just set up with the UN for mayors. So it's the UN Council on Urban Initiatives, bringing city mayors around the world together to think about cities as being on the front lines of climate change. And they are, whether they like it or not. The question is, how can you equip mayors? What do mayors need also in terms of, you know, tools, also in terms of their budgeting and how they think about their industrial strategy, with climate at the center, getting all the different sectors to work together, for example, around the future of mobility in a city.
Can I make one quick point on the city point, which I'm repeating something made to me the other day, because one of the things we're working on, others are working on, we're trying to accelerate, which is using DLT to distributed ledger to track carbon all the way through the supply chain, and bring it to a point of responsibility, not where it's produced, but where it's consumed and where it's responsible. And you know, it's on the order of magnitude now of 80% plus of carbon is consumed in cities. I mean, it's products that are generated for the service of those in cities. So then how do you work backwards from that, quote, responsibility? Again, it's another approach to assign and incentivize the type of changes that are needed. So the city's work is critical.
That's really interesting too, because it gets into this conversation that it's certainly big in the US about how much should this be top down, how much should be bottom up, you know, what part needs to be decentralized versus centralized. Let me just, because we've only got about 15 minutes or so left, let me move on to a couple really important audience questions. First, about China. And it's kind of amazing that we've gotten to the point without mentioning China yet. But, one could argue that climate is, the low-hanging fruit in terms of the US and the EU working with China. I'm also curious, and Mark, I'll direct this to you first. This is not part of the question, but just something I wonder about. If you put a price on carbon, how does that work with China? How does that, what does that mean for their state-run system, for the way that their own political economy works?
Yeah. So, well, first, your question is about if when China puts their emission trading scheme and gets it up and running. So, for those who are following us closely, I mean, they are on the verge of having a price on carbon for some aspects of the. So, and certainly, yeah, that the question in China, which is the question for all of us in terms of prices on carbon, is not just the level and the trajectory, but the coverage of that price on carbon. And the sort of secret, maybe not so secret for those who really focus on it, is the coverage of the economy of the price on carbon tends to be quite low. And so one of the issues, for example, one of the issues in the EU and the UK, it's an issue of universal application, but is expanding the coverage, expanding to commercial real estate, expanding to transportation sector, and the incentives that come from that. So that's the first point I'd make. So coverage and impact. Second point, which I know you've thought a lot about, Rana and Mariana as well, is around the interaction with the trading system, and of course this issue of sort of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Europe's put it on the table. The U.S. as well, even though the U.S. doesn't have a price on carbon, and best as I can tell, doesn't have, that's not on the near-term horizon. And so what's the interaction, what potentially are the trade remedies, which goes back to that could evolve, and how can there be trade remedies if countries have different coverage of carbon prices, including no carbon prices, but actually have other mechanisms, such as regulation or even subsidies or other measures that mean the carbon content of the product is lower than, so there's a interaction between product standards, think steel, right? This is the issue. So because in the end, and last point to build up, which is that, of course, this then it has an issue with, in terms of interaction with WTO rules. It's easier to do on a price, but ultimately what we're talking about is reducing greenhouse gases. So we stabilize the temperature. So if you have a product that's lower carbon, but isn't, as a result of a carbon price, should you, anyways, there's a huge set of issues that many of which will be ignored in the kind of an imperfect approach here.
Mariana, do you want to jump in on any low-hanging fruit with China that we should be thinking about?
Well, just, what I find interesting with China is that, because of its urgent pollution problem, which if you've been to Beijing recently or pre-COVID when we were flying, you'll know it's a huge problem. They are actually investing. This is pre-Biden, green infrastructure bill. They already had a real plan. It was, I think, $2 trillion to be spent in 5 years on basically greening every single sector, old sectors, new sectors, to the point that some countries, little countries, we often talk about these big countries, Russia, China, US, but some countries that actually had what again, I would argue is a kind of a strategic mission-oriented type of public policy, were able to react to that as an opportunity. So Denmark, tiny country, is currently the #1 producer of high-tech digital green services to Chinese manufacturing. And that is very much on the back, actually, of city level, coming back to city level policies, like in Copenhagen, trying to make Copenhagen the greenest city in Europe. That meant that the startup scene wasn't just startups creating kind of random gadgets and 140 character apps, but actually helping its own country and the city provide new types of services for those sectors and companies that wanted to transform. So what's interesting in Denmark is not only do they have manufacturing capacity around companies like Vestas, obviously a very green company, but also the services that go along with that. And China needed that. And, that's an opportunity as opposed to a threat. So coming back to the kind of global dimension of all of this, that, instead of always looking at it as a, who's going to kind of beat who, how can we make this an opportunity for investment, an opportunity for innovation? But that doesn't come about out of thin air. It actually requires a strategy also at the local level.
Yeah. So let me ask another, kind of bring in another big picture question. We've touched on some of the key industries that are involved in rethinking climate change: steel, agriculture, housing. Big opportunity in housing. Mark, what should we be doing there?
Yeah, it's an enormous issue. So it's absolutely right. And you said earlier, Rana, what about things that people can touch? It doesn't get much more local than your own home, apartment, flat. And in a number of, virtually every economy, there is relatively low hanging fruit in the housing sector to improve the efficiency of the housing sector. I'm going to give the positives and then around the execution. Secondly, this is in general labor intensive. It's investment, so it has big economic multipliers, and there's houses everywhere. So you have a regional aspect to it as well. It's not all concentrated in, I'm in London at the moment, so it's not just a London issue in the UK. It's a national issue. So it's important for moving forward on the climate, but it has, it has those ancillary, real, tangible economic benefits of jobs, incomes, improvements, and it's of course. The point of it, it's not to make people's houses worse, it's to make people's houses better, more energy efficient and the like. And I think one of the issues around this, at least in my experience, has been the governments have often been too timid around the policy here. So it's been on the margin, we'll give you £10,000, some sort of loan to reduce your, to do cladding on the house or, better windows and things like that, as opposed to much more comprehensive. So one of the debates right now in the UK, or the issues, is, Mariana will correct me on the exact numbers, but they're looking to have 600,000 heat pumps installed in houses per annum by the middle of or the latter part of this decade. And of course, those will be quite significant cost savings. Now, a heat pump is something like I want to say that rolls up to about £6 billion per annum on current costs of heat pumps. Now, if you're buying 600,000 heat pumps, here's an example where if you're doing it at scale and you're doing it properly, it shouldn't cost 6 billion. It should cost, 4 or 3, or, it should come down with some economies of scale and scaling it up. But it's that orders of magnitude. But the payback of the return is, for society, the payback is quite substantial. For the homeowner, it's can be a 30-year payback for some of these investments. So it's, most people don't think in terms of 30 years, number one. Number two, they don't have that kind of money lying around in order to make that investment. It's very clear that it's very clear, at least to me, that a substantial proportion of that should be borne publicly. You want some incentive alignment in order to get it done, but you have the big pull-through benefits. So I'm giving one component of the housing thing. Let me give one other thing and then I'll shut up, which is, of course, one of the other elements that is incredibly attractive from an economic perspective is we are moving relatively quickly towards a distributed generation world. So that, and you're seeing it first with businesses. So what's happening with companies is right now they're, okay, I'm going to go net zero. One of my problems is my scope 2 emissions, where I get power from. A bunch of those companies are not saying, well, I'll wait for that's the grid, the local utilities job, hurry up. They're saying, no, I'm going to install renewable power. I'm going to use that renewable power. And I have the ability, either now or soon, to sell excess back into the grid and get some return on that. So you get much more distributed. In the auto sector, so there's two things, and I'm going to bring it all back to Elon here, but one thing is, some extent, you got credit where credit's due, but the solar roofs. So in a world where you have a solar roof and an electric vehicle, that is plugged in at night, you've got two things. One, you either have the solar to the vehicle, but very importantly, and this is with charging, is you have a distributed, akin to, you have generation capacity, or sorry, storage capacity akin to the capacity that we have in the cloud in our computers. So you can draw on that for load shifting and other things as part of a fully, smart distributed grid. That's not tomorrow, but it's not, it's within our, certainly, well, it's within, even within my lifetime, Rana.
I can see it. I can see it in my
Yeah.
neighborhood. My
Yeah.
neighbor's getting subsidies for solar panels on the roof, and there's plenty of Teslas sitting outside. So
And exactly, but also, and then the technology and the ability to then pull it back in. So that pull it back in for broader uses, and the efficiency we'll get from that. And so on the housing side, so those are two, from the heat pumps to the distributed generation, two big opportunities there. And I think it will be a sustained area of focus, and it needs to be.
you had a quick point on housing.
Yeah, I mean, just to also make it, as Mark was saying in the beginning, kind of mean something to people. The reason that my kids, and I've got 4 of them, all know about the plastic-free ocean, mission and problem, is that there was this great movie, the documentary Blue Planet by David Attenborough, that last episode that just spoke to kids all over the world. I mean, every kid who saw that series now knows there's lots of plastic in the ocean, and these, baby dolphins and animals are dying from choking on it. And there's something about the housing question that I think can be made more inspirational, right? I mean, and that's where cities again come back in, because people live in houses. They also see each other. There's, communities, there's neighborhoods, and there's something about how can we make this not just about retrofitting and heat pumps, which are also extremely important, and all the kind of just transition skills that are needed in construction workers in order to do that, but also about a conversation, coming back to our early point about debating value. How do we want to live together? So bringing housing associations, so residents in, for example, social housing, of which there's lots of in London. This is, again, another council that I'm co-chair of with Georgia Gould, the leader of Camden Council. We've put the housing estates themselves at the center of Camden's carbon neutral missions, but that has required bringing citizen assemblies and citizens together to talk about it. So it's not this top down, like you will be better off because this thing is good, but also what does even living in a more sustainable way mean, including, by the way, with the urban food kind of initiatives that have been popping up.
It's so interesting, and this is happening in the U.S. as well, but it's being private sector led by cooperative housing groups, often people who've gotten into mobile home collectives. It's not so much government. Mark, you had a quick point?
No, I was just going to reinforce what you both just have, which is the value, again, of having that common understanding, building that understanding, and then the pull coming from the community. Hugely.
And a debate, right? Because people won't necessarily agree. I had a conversation with Olafur Eliasson, a wonderful artist who's done a lot around climate, for an exhibit he did, and we were debating as part of the exhibit the notion of public space. And he said something I'll never forget. He said, public space, as an architect, a designer, an artist, he was thinking about it as a space where you feel safe to disagree. And think how different that is from social media and all the hate that's there. So actually creating spaces in our communities, and that itself should be a part of the sustainability agenda, right? How do we want to discuss, debate, talk about disagreeing along the way, how we want to live together with, climate related targets at the center, but to also make it kind of fun. I mean, that's where, again, like all these like new kind of urban gardens around, people also in cities growing their own food, but together, right? Is so important.
Well, it's funny. I not to toot my own horn, but I just wrote in this past weekend FT about Jane Jacobs, the urban activist, and her lessons for today, which touched on a lot of this. So please go read.
It's well worth it. I'll endorse. I'll endorse her. Yes.
So let me just, in the last couple of minutes we have left, let me ask you a really fascinating question that's come through from the audience, and something I think a lot about. We've been talking about many of these things for a long time. The principles of a Green New Deal were established more than 12 years ago. And this audience member is asking why so few politicians and political parties have taken up the ideas or recognized the interlinking. I mean, you can argue that maybe it's broader than we think, but it's fascinating because in the US, we basically have AOC being, a very visible person behind this. In the UK and in Germany, there are other folks. I'm wondering, and I'll kind of build on this question, to me, there's a demographic sea change that's happening here. I see so much overlap between, say, German Greens and young millennial progressives in America. I mean, are we about to see some kind of grassroots, ground up swell in connectivity activism here that is maybe going to really be different than what we've seen in the past? And if you want to answer this and then add any other final comments, Mark, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, well, I'll start. This is my last chance. Let me thank you, Rana, for excellent pushing in ideas, and Mariana for wow and everything you're doing and having me on. I've learned a lot. I've taken more than I've given. I can assure you on that. Yeah. The first thing I'll say is that obviously there is by definition an intergenerational element to this crisis, and a responsibility being belatedly taken on. And that the force of argument and ideas and energy from younger people on this is incredibly powerful and moves it forward. And don't stop. Like, it has a bigger impact than maybe it is recognized, even though things are not moving as fast. And it's one of the reasons why this is finally mainstreaming in terms of topics and let's hope action. That's first 2 points. Third is, it goes back to this value point, which is that the importance of social movements, importance of social consensus, importance of drive, and saying, what do we want as a society and where do we want to go? What are our priorities? Agree that as much as possible. And then we have our moment, and our moment isn't measured in, a 1 year or 2 year term of some congressperson, but it's measured until we have accomplished what we want. Yeah. And the main thing being the main thing, but the main thing being defined by people, and this may have been talked about for decades in various guys, but that social consensus had not formed to a critical degree. And there's of course a whole science of these tipping points and what it takes in order to get them. But we have reached that point. I'm convinced of it. We've left it very late, but we've reached that point, and we need to honor that consensus by achieving what it wants.
Well, I would agree that. Mariana, last word to you.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I completely agree. And this idea that we can't afford to get it wrong this time, because climate is actually different, which doesn't mean it's more important, but it is different. The climate, the health pandemic, obviously it's hard to imagine right now anything more important than that. But with climate, we can't get it wrong. And so this idea that what is the purpose, for both private companies, public sector organizations, citizen societies, citizen organizations, how can they actually work together to find solutions for this problem? And then working backwards, especially on the government side, where we focus a lot on in the Institute, which is what does it actually mean for redesigning the existing tools which haven't worked? Coming to the question, which is, we've been talking about this for a long time. Where have the bottlenecks been? We can't just give out money. We can't just have an industrial strategy that gives money to life sciences, finance, automotive, aerospace, without saying, what are these sectors for? What are we going to try to do together in order to solve the problems of our time? That requires a serious new design of the tools. And I think that, the fact that business is talking a bit about this for the first time, I think in a long time, in the last, I'd say 5 years, this notion of purpose and stakeholder value, the problem is it has to become mandatory, right? Companies should have to actually report in order to get any investment, their carbon prices and how that's actually in their long run strategic plan. We need to take out of the periphery, take out of the voluntary, take out of the charitable, and put it at the center of the system. And that's why conditionalities in the social contract are so key. And so the deal of the Green Deal.
Well, we covered a lot of ground. We didn't cover everything in depth, but I think we gave a real flavor for how broad and big and exciting this topic is. Want to thank both of you all, Mariana and Mark, for being here. Thanks for having me. This conversation is going to be uploaded in about a week to the Institute's YouTube channel, so you can download it and listen. And with that, we will close. Thanks to you both, and have
thank
a great
you, Rana. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.